The concept of what it means to be a Sigma male has drawn attention since it represents a group of traits that many people find respectable and appealing. Fundamentally, a Sigma male is seen to have a quiet kind of dominance that isn't always demonstrated by obvious leadership or social domination, but rather by self-assured assurance and independence. This kind is particularly interesting since they are frequently described as enigmatic, isolated, and unusual. A lot of individuals would want to fit into this group, yet being quiet, introverted, or private does not make someone a Sigma male. It's important to realize that the Sigma male archetype is not merely a list of certain personality traits, but rather more inherent in nature and represents a particular blend of attributes. Even if someone may identify with a few Sigma male traits, this does not automatically turn that person into a Sigma male. Therefore, I thought it would be vital to talk about 7 obvious signs that you are not a Sigma male, regardless of whether you identify as one or wish to be one. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Now let's get started. Number 1. You have a strong desire to show everyone how unique you are. It's likely that you are not a true Sigma male if you have ever felt the need to declare to the world that you are unique or exceptional. This is a result of the inherent confidence that real Sigma males possess. They're aware of their uniqueness, yet do not require confirmation from others. They don't feel the need to identify oneself in order to be different or gain approval. These are the kinds of men who are confident in who they are and don't want validation from others to feel special or valuable. Because a genuine Sigma male, well, they'd want to remain that silent power in the background. It may be worthwhile to look behind the designation if someone consistently claims to be a Sigma male. In contrast to real Sigma males who don't want attention, fake Sigma males are eager to flaunt their Sigma male status because they are trying to stand out and attract attention. Number 2. You guard your interests and hobbies. Have you ever encountered someone who seems guarded or exclusive when it comes to their interests, as like they are gatekeeping a hidden treasure? Some people act in this way in order to preserve their feeling of individuality and superiority. They treasure the notion of being informed, and occasionally it starts to feel like a source of self-worth. But before you assume that being a gatekeeper equates to being a Sigma male, consider again. Such games are not played by true Sigma males. To feel different, they don't have to hide behind activities. Rather, they focus more on motivating and sharing. They will be happy to welcome you on the journey and will happily expose you to their hobbies. Knowledge and enthusiasm, after all, are intended to be shared, not kept, by a real Sigma male. Number 3. You complain everything and everything all the time. You may have come across individuals who constantly seem to find something wrong with everything, are quick to criticize and propagate negativity. These kinds of actions are very different from the traits that define a Sigma male. True Sigma males have a stern character that they have frequently developed over years of hardships and tribulations. They now know how to ignore the clamor, accept change, and withstand storms. It's not about denying emotions, but rather knowing which fights to choose. Life is too short, in their opinion, for pointless complaints. Therefore, it's obvious that someone who is caught up in an endless cycle of complaints has not yet overcome their victim mindset and is far from possessing the strong will of a Sigma male. The exact opposite of what it means to be a Sigma male is someone who is always stuck in a cycle of whining and is therefore viewed as weak. Number 4. You only reflect what other people are thinking. In today's world, it's all too frequent to witness people who, in an effort to fit in, exactly replicate the views and opinions of their friends and relatives. True Sigma males carve out their own intellectual and philosophical paths. They don't base their thoughts and beliefs on the newest trending tweet or headline. They are the result of in-depth contemplation, extensive investigation, and first-hand experience. The Sigma male stands out at a time where echo chambers are common and many people only repeat stories from the media. Others may choose to follow the prevailing perspective, but Sigma male digs deep to uncover his facts. They don't fear hatred because of their dissenting views or thoughts. Number 5. Your fear of taking chances. Imagine yourself perched on an edge, kilometers underneath the surface of the earth, with the wind's fierce gusts testing your every step. Leaping is about believing that you can manage whatever comes next, not about knowing that you will land safely. The attitude of a Sigma male is centered around this trust. They take on problems not because they are careless, but because they have a firm faith in their capacity to bounce back and adjust. Conversely, a person disguising themselves as a Sigma male will frequently play things safe and avoid falling. Their anxieties serve as a stabilizing force, exposing a lack of that innate Sigma male confidence. Being a real Sigma male, after all, isn't about never falling, but about getting back up every time you do. Number 6. You give too much thought to what other people think of you. Imagine yourself in a room full of people who are observing every motion you make and every word you say. Some people spend their days living in this chamber, bound by the opinions and views of others like invisible chains. These people frequently become into people pleasers, shaping themselves to meet the constantly shifting demands of the community. However, this is not how the Sigma male does things. Sigma males flourish outside this chamber. They are free from the clamor of opinions from around them and dance to their own beat. They understand the common reality that not everyone will like you. They pursue their goals and aspirations without being constrained by the dread of doubters, as opposed to seeking approval. Being a Sigma male is embracing one's true self without letting the need for acceptance from others dilute it. A true Sigma male is aware that it is impossible to win over everyone's approval and acceptance in the world. For whatever reason, there will always be someone who dislikes you. Number 7. You think every point in this video must apply to you to be a Sigma male. True Sigma males understand that there are no perfect fits in any categories in life. Every person's path creates a special fusion of attributes, shortcomings, and experiences. Certain characteristics may ring true, but a Sigma male's soul and perspective are what really distinguish them apart. Instead of pursuing a to-do list, they are pursuing confidence. A real Sigma male never tries to fit into any category. Instead, they are true to themselves. Whether he agrees with the concepts presented in this video or not is irrelevant to a true Sigma male. He isn't worried about fitting into a mold. Instead, he may utilize them as a reference to better understand himself on his path to self-discovery and progress. A fake Sigma male will believe that in order to feel special or different, they must stick to all of the conventional characteristics of what it means to be a Sigma male. They will also usually make excessive attempts to conform into a particular personality type. The fact is that there isn't a one definition of what it means to be a Sigma male that applies to everyone. Do you think the issues I raised in this video are valid? Tell me in the comments below. See some additional videos for more content about Sigma males. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more Sigma male videos. See you in our next video on your screen.